So welcome everybody. We'll get started. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the 1st Division Museum, which you can't see because it's closed. Has been since last Veterans Day, but I want to welcome you to Cantini. Well, many familiar faces here, but in case you are here for the first time, this is the historic home of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and a man who passed away in 1955 as a multimillionaire and extremely accomplished in a long list of things, had no children. And so he left this, his country estate, this was the countryside then, as a public park for the people of Illinois. If you've come here from Wisconsin or Indiana, you're equally welcome as the people from Illinois. Nothing in Colonel McCormick's life was more important to him than his service in World War I as a citizen soldier. Cantini is named after a little village in France where I've been many times, the scene of America's first battle in World War I, the first battle in the history of the 1st Division, so named because it is America's 1st Division. And this year we are celebrating its centennial. It was organized for World War I in 1917 and has been on continuous active duty every single day for 100 years this summer. So that's quite a thing. Anyway, Colonel McCormick served in that division. That's why there's a 1st Division Museum here at Cantini. That's why Cantini is named Cantini. That's why we're here. And our mission is not only to present the history of the 1st Infantry Division, but also to acquaint the public, to help facilitate a discussion with the public about our common defense and about the military affairs of the United States. And so it's in that vein that we welcome tonight's speaker. Before I do that, I do want to make a couple of real quick announcements. One is that this is being videotaped and will be on our YouTube channel later on. So if you've got a cell phone, I'd appreciate you silencing those. When we get to the question and answer, I think we have microphones here. Yeah, and Melissa and I will walk around and hand you a mic. If you don't have the mic, we won't be able to pick up the audio of your question on the tape, so we'd appreciate you working with us on that. Pat has published an incredible book, which is for sale in the gift shop down that way, and you can go get one and have it, bring it back to him, and I'm sure he'll sign it over to you. Finally, the 1st Division Museum is closed. It will reopen. The grand reopening is on August 26th. I would absolutely love to have you here. Just be forewarned that you'll be one of what we think is probably several thousand, right? But it's going to be awesome. We got people coming up from Fort Riley. We'll have active duty troops here. We'll have veterans here. We'll have a band and just all kinds of stuff. So it'll be worth your time, even if you may not be able to get immediately into the museum because everybody's going to be trying to do that. Or anytime after August 26th, 6 days a week, we'll be open. We're closed on Mondays, and that'll be for the rest of the year. The principal purpose of the renovation, principal purpose of many, was to extend the story out past the war in Vietnam, which of course has been 50 years now, because the division, our Army, our armed forces have done a great deal since the division came home from Vietnam in 1970. And so we're going to tell that story in a new gallery, but we're also refreshing everything else. Knock on wood, it is on time, on budget, and it's going to be awesome. It'll be small, but it's going to be awesome. You don't want to miss coming back to Cantini and seeing the renovated 1st Division Museum. Okay, so enough about that. Tonight's speaker is Pat Proctor. He'll be up here in just a second. He is an active duty lieutenant colonel of field artillery in the United States Army. Just graduated from the U.S. Army War College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He is a veteran of the conflicts both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, multiple tours to those places, in one of which he was commanding a task force of the 1st Infantry Division, the 2nd Battalion, 32nd Field Artillery. The 32nd Field Artillery has a very distinguished record, combat record of the 1st Infantry Division. along with going all over the world and serving at the risk of his life in our common defense. Pat's managed to publish a half dozen articles, a couple of books, so on and so forth. And on one of those tours, he was one of a very, very small group of really smart officers who were strategic advisors to General David Petraeus when he was in command of our forces in Iraq. He has a PhD in history from Kansas State University, and he is currently assigned to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and to the United States Army Command and General Staff College, which is located there. So Pat is an intellectual and a scholar and a historian and a soldier and a person who has served his country very, very well. We're delighted to have him and his wife, Ari, who's seated right here to my front left with Melissa. We're delighted to have both of them here to Cantini. Pat talked here in 2012, and so it's my great privilege to welcome back to Cantini Lieutenant Colonel Pat Proctor.
So when you put it all in one paragraph, all that stuff I did, I'm reminded, me and my wife were talking about, the last time I was here. Since then, I've done 2 combat tours, 2 promotions, and 2 degrees, and I think it's time we took a vacation, honey. So, just tired. So, thank you, Paul, and I'd also like to thank J.D. Camus, who couldn't be here today, for inviting me out here to talk. This is a really special place for me. I am a Big Red 1 soldier, 5 years in the 1st Division in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, this place holds a special place in my heart. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. As I've served throughout the global war on terror, a lot of times people come up and they thank me for my service. What I'd like to do today is I'd like to thank all of you for your service. Whether you served in uniform, or you were spouse to someone in uniform, or you're just a concerned citizen who took the time today to come and learn something about the history of our nation. I want to thank you for your service in being an informed citizenry, and for those who served, of course, for defending our nation. As I go around airports, I talk to veterans, especially Vietnam War veterans, Korean War veterans, World War II veterans, and they talk to me, and they thank me for my service. I'm really, frankly, kind of embarrassed because the wars that those men fought, that many people in this audience fought. I'm humbled to be a part of the brotherhood that you guys have forged. So thank you. What I'd like to talk about today, I'm not going to be able to talk about the entire book, but what I would like to talk about today is why we remember the Vietnam War the way we remember it. Because there's a lot in the book that I just can't touch on in an hour setting. So I really want to focus on that. And so that's what really the core of the book is about. And my publisher will bring me away in chains if I don't show a picture of the book at least once. So that's the obligatory picture. But black helicopters will come and take me away if I don't also say this. I am an active duty Army officer, so I'm here today to talk to you about my views about these topics, and any questions that you want to ask me on any topics, I'd be happy to talk about, but they're my own views. I'm not exactly sure what the Department of Defense's view is on the Vietnam War. I don't know if they have one. But I'm not here giving it to you if they do have a position. I'm here talking really for myself. But again, what I want to talk about today is why we remember the Vietnam War the way we do. And that's a really complicated question, as I found out, because this was my history PhD dissertation topic, and it seemed like an easy question when I thought it up. But 2 years and a lot of archives and a lot of thinking about it and writing it later, it's a complicated question. I think the first reason it's a complicated question is because you have to ask, what do you mean when you say we remember? Because depending on where you sat or where you stood during the Vietnam War, or where you sit or stand now, if you were not alive then, I was barely alive then, that you have a very different memory of what the Vietnam War is. And so this is really, for the general public, the folks that didn't have somebody who served there, the folks that really didn't have a particular political position on one side or the other of the war. This is their picture of the war. Obviously, a human tragedy, but at the core of it, there's this idea that's emerged really over the 50, 60 years since the war, that we were somehow lied into this war, that the American public was tricked into going to Vietnam. And I was very interested by that question, because at the time I first thought about this question, I was sitting in Iraq, and I had just come from the United States, and now I'm sitting in Iraq. And the debate here was why we were tricked into Iraq, weapons of mass destruction and all that. And so that's really what spurred me to think about this. But if you weren't in tune to the war on a daily basis, this was really, this is really the war you remember, a human tragedy that ended with America not necessarily achieving their strategic ends, and this lingering feeling that we're not even sure why we went there in the first place, and we were tricked into going there. So if you're a veteran, whether you're a veteran of the Vietnam War, or you're a veteran of other wars, or you're a family member of a veteran of the Vietnam War, this is probably more the way we remember the war, right? We remember those who were in chains, POWs during the war, and bringing them home. But we also remember all those who didn't come home. And if you have not had a chance to go to the Vietnam Memorial, I absolutely encourage you to do that, because it really is just a sobering experience, especially for those who've served. But there's this idea that if you served, or you knew somebody who served, or if you've served since then, there's this idea that we went there, and we maybe didn't go there for the right reasons, or the reasons that we were told we were going there weren't the reasons we were actually going there. This idea of kind of deception surrounding the war, and that's kind of the common thread between these two kind of pictures of the war. So there's also another we, right? There's the folks who oppose the war, and I would also classify those that identify themselves now as folks in opposition to current American foreign policy. You saw this last week the G20 summit, people outside protesting with masks on and marching in the streets. They probably identify with this conception of the war. And this conception of the war is the idea that America was lied into the war, and America was lied to about the war while it was going on, and this idea that there was a deception that led us into the war, and then a deception that kept us there. And this is maybe not the picture that a lot of people in this room take away from the war. Certainly not a picture I identify with, but it's one that's very, very real for a large portion of the American public. And it's when you watch retrospectives of the war, it's very prominent in documentaries about the war. The anti-war protest, maybe more than the actual number of people who actually participated in the anti-war protest. It gets pretty big billing as a constituency during the war. And then there's the Hollywood picture of the war, right? And as a military professional, I've studied this war pretty much my entire adult life. But if you're not terribly interested in U.S. foreign policy, and you don't know anybody who served, this may be your picture of the Vietnam War. So for some people, when we say how we remember the war, this is all they have to remember the war by. And this is a whole interesting topic, that a lot of history's been done on, that I would love to dive into, but don't have time to dive into. But there have been kind of distinct periods as Hollywood wrestled with the Vietnam War and how to tell the war. There was the Deer Hunter, there was the period with Apocalypse Now, and then later on you start getting the Oliver Stone movies about the war, and then you have some kind of one-off movies. Full Metal Jacket being one that's pretty prominent in American pop culture as a picture of the Vietnam War. And recently, we've had a spate of different kinds of movies. It confounds me, but there are comedies about the Vietnam War. I have a hard time wrapping my head around that, but there are comedies made about the war. Obviously, at the a little after the Vietnam period, you also had MASH, which was about Korea, but they were really talking about the Vietnam War. But really, the first time that Hollywood took on the Vietnam War directly in comedy is pretty recent. But what's heartwarming to me is that now we're starting to get some movies about the war that frankly take it a little more seriously. To look at it from the perspective of the people who served. We were soldiers. The great Hal Moore just died recently, but that was a great monument to his contribution to the nation's defense. But there have been some other pretty serious looks at the war, Hamburger Hill, some other movies. But those movies aside, the vast majority of Hollywood movies about the war, there's always this nugget of we got lied into the war. That the entire monologue narrative of Apocalypse Now is about how fed up this guy is with the lies that got us into the war and the lies about the war. Really a recurring theme in the Hollywood picture. So again, you've got this picture of deception, that we were lied into the war, we were lied to about the war. And that really, like I said, that kind of fascinated me, especially sitting in Iraq and hearing a very similar conversation about weapons of mass destruction and the Iraq War. So this, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, where I sit and how I remembered the war before I started really studying this question. And this is really kind of the picture of the current military and especially the soldiers that served since the Vietnam War. And again, this is an evolving picture, right? And it very much depends on what's going on at the time of at the time as to how the Army has looked back at the war. But when I came in the Army in the 90s, there was this narrative, this kind of almost myth of the Vietnam War and the post-war recovery from the Vietnam War and the rebuilding of the U.S. Army. I came in around the time of the Gulf War. I was actually in basic training when Saddam Hussein, not to make anybody feel old, but I was in basic training when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait back in '89. And at that period and immediately after in Desert Storm, this narrative was that, in Vietnam broke the Army. The Army was in shambles. The Army was in terrible shape. And, a lot of great Army leaders throughout the 70s and 80s, through a training revolution and through a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication, rebuilt the Army that then went on to defeat Saddam Hussein in the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq in Desert Storm and kind of bury the ghost of Vietnam, which was the picture that I came into the Army with. But we all know the ghost wasn't exactly buried. It rose again when the Iraq War started, and initially we struggled a lot with counterinsurgency. And so there was a second period, and I've got a picture there, the Eating Soup with a Knife, which is John Nagel's book, which came out at that time, comparing the Vietnam War and the British experience in Malaya, and then the counterinsurgency manual that came out of all those studies from Jerome Petraeus. And during that period, which I also was in the Army for, I was actually at CGSC at Fort Leavenworth at the time. The narrative was that we had forgotten all of these lessons of Vietnam, all these things that we were so good at during Vietnam. We had squandered those lessons getting good for Desert Storm, and we needed to recover those lessons and relearn those lessons and inculcate them into our Army. Now we're kind of in a new period, and I don't want to dwell on it, but the period we're in now is this, as Iraq and Afghanistan sort of wind down. We're still there and we're still fighting, but not in the large numbers that we were when I was there. As these wars wind down and the Army's trying to look again to being proficient at what it calls its core competencies, by which it means high-intensity combat or high-intensity conflict, they're looking back at that period again between the 70s and the 90, when the Army rebuilt itself after Vietnam. And this latest book about General Dupuy is kind of in a lot of ways, a re-mythologizing of that period, a re-examination of that period and what brought us out of Vietnam and back to the Army that won in Desert Storm. And so we're kind of back in that phase. And I imagine 20 years, 10 years from now, I'll be sitting in this audience and they may be going back the other way. This may be a pendulum which goes way back before any of us. But that really is the we that we in active service think about when we remember Vietnam. But in all of that, there's, again, kind of this idea that maybe we went to war for the wrong reasons, or we went to war not understanding the war that we were going to get into, or Joe McMaster's book made a very strong case, dereliction of duty, that we went into war and we didn't really speak truth to power and tell them this is what it was going to take to win. And so there's this idea of dishonesty, this idea of deception again, underlying the war. And of course, there's also this idea that we were winning all the battles, but the American people, lost faith or lost patience with how long it was taking to win. And so there's there's still a lot of bruised feelings and a lot of, kind of that underlying angst about the war, and it centers on this idea of deception. But before and that's really what I want to talk about today is why we remember it that way. Because even, I hope what I've kind of shown here is no matter where you sit, there is kind of this idea that there's deception or lies surrounding the war. And why do we remember that way? But before I talk about that, I really need to talk about how else we could be remembering the war. These are the things we don't remember about the Vietnam War, the things that have kind of been lost in all the histories about the Vietnam War. And the first one is Vietnam here in the United States, just like the Iraq War, the Vietnam War was a political debate. It was a debate between those people who thought that we should intervene militarily and those people who thought that we shouldn't intervene militarily. And just like the Iraq War or any other war, frankly, that we fought in our history, people coalesce around what side of that debate they're on. And they find alliances and they find people who are like-minded and they work together to try to achieve their goal. And so something that we forget about the Vietnam War, or that has not been really captured in histories, is this idea that the anti-war movement was not just John Kerry throwing his medals over the fence and showing up at the Senate and giving a speech. It was a political movement, and it had politicians in it. And it really, the nugget of it really started with the Civil Rights Movement. So John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, very early in their presidency, forged an alliance with the Civil Rights Movement, and that even though John Kennedy died and Lyndon Johnson became the president, that Democratic coalition with civil rights really continued on throughout the war and metastasized in a lot of ways into a significant piece of the anti-war movement. After Richard Nixon won the war, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. started protesting against the war. It's no accident that he waited until there wasn't a Democrat in office before he started to protest. It was about that political alliance. Also, you see here, this is a really interesting picture in the bottom left corner, Ted Kennedy speaking, and down there in the bottom right, you can see John Kerry. So that relationship was not just with the Civil Rights Movement, it was also with the newer anti-war movements and the Vietnam veterans against the war. It was a political movement. It was not just a bunch of teenagers out there burning draft cards and protesting. It was a political movement that went into the halls of power in Congress and also went into academia and some other places that I'll show here in a minute. Here's something else we don't remember about the war. The peace movement wasn't always terribly peaceful. And there were a lot of, especially later in the war, that peace movement really metastasized into, frankly, a low-level revolution in this country. You read, as part of this research, I did a lot of reading in the writings of the students of the Democratic Society, but also kind of some of the subsequent organizations that came out of that, like the Workers' Party, which was straight communist, old-style communist, the Weather Underground, which got President Obama into some trouble when he was running for office. Those organizations came out of the anti-war movement, and they were violent. Many of those folks spent a significant time in jail. Many of those folks had to flee the country to flee prosecution. But that is we think of the peace movement, and we think of the girl putting the flower in the rifle of the National Guardsman. That was certainly going on, but there was a very small minority of that movement that was much more violent, and that becomes important in this political debate and why we remember the war the way we do, and I'll talk about it here in a minute. But something else that we don't remember about the war, it's almost invisible now in histories of the war, is that there was a pro-war movement. There was not just an anti-war movement in this country. There was a significant number of people, Nixon in 68 or 69, we call it the silent majority. There was a large number of people in this country who supported the war and believed that we were there for the right reasons and believed that we needed to stay until we had achieved the nation's goals in that country, which was a secure South Vietnam that wasn't under attack from North Vietnam. And so, we think today, it's almost a trope now to hear people talk about the liberal media or the left-wing media. But up there in the top left corner, that is pretty representative of how the mainstream media looked at the anti-war movement. It's a picture of a couple of protesters putting up a sign of Mao Zedong, the communist chairman of China, and the sign says, "We need you," or "I need you," like he's enlisting peace movement folks in the communist movement. Like it's all a subversion of America. This was a pretty common view. Even in network news, you would hear folks that we think of as liberal media making some pretty scathing remarks about the anti-war movement. They were not much more happy about it than most of the country. Another neat picture here that's completely gone from the history. We all remember, and we all, you've probably seen in a dozen documentaries about the shooting at Kent State, where 4 students were shot by National Guardsmen in the protests over the invasion of Cambodia. This is on the bottom right is a pro-war march that happened after those students were shot, because there was a big eruption of protests by students after those students were shot, and the pro-war movement, they rallied and they began to march in support of the war. This is 1970. This is not 65 when the war first really kicked off. This is pretty late in the war, and that support for the nation's goals in Vietnam was prominent through much of the war, and I'll talk about that. But one more way that we don't really remember the war is this was American government policy, and this policy was supported by the American government. That first picture there on the left is of the signing of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but basically it's the resolution in which Congress told the president, we authorize and support anything that you want to do to protect South Vietnam from subversion, anything at all. And every single congressman and only 2 senators voted against it. Every single congressman and every single senator except for 2 voted yes on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and they all showed up for the prominent members all showed up for the signing of that. Up there in the top right is the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all standing next to the president right after he announced that he was going to send ground troops. Showing support for the president by their presence and not speaking out in the media. And again, I mentioned General HR McMaster's book. This is really prominent in his book. For him, there were a lot of interpretations of his book when he became the National Security Advisor here recently. But what his book actually said was these men were derelict because they didn't make the president do more up front, because they didn't voice their objections to the gradual escalation of the war. That he was not objecting to the fact that those generals supported the war. And they did support the war, but they thought that it should be fought a lot more aggressively than we initially fought it. That last picture there in the bottom right for you is international leaders. The Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was something like NATO, though it didn't have like a guaranteed defense clause in it, was a treaty alliance that South Vietnam was part of, we were part of, Australia was part of, Philippines, South Korea. All those countries supported the defense of South Vietnam. And these are things that we don't really hear about now, that in histories of the war we don't really remember about the war. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is why do we remember it that way? Why do we remember it as a war that we were lied into, that the American people didn't support, that the subsequent presidents, Johnson and Nixon, lied to keep America in? Why do we remember it that way if it was supported by so many? And why do we mythologize the anti-war movement if there were kind of these things, there's things about it that make you question, whether it was, all pure, or if there were some ulterior motives to it. To answer that, we really need to talk for just a second about why we were in Vietnam in the first place, and that's a question for more than an hour. Many books have been written on that by historians way better than me. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about it. And the first thing that you need to understand why we were in Vietnam was World War II. World War II was the bloodiest, most destructive war in the history of mankind, and it still is, hands down. 60 million people died. 60 million people. 3% of the world population was killed in a period of about 6 or 7 years, if you include, the time when Japan was fighting in China and the time before we entered the war. Just the Soviet Union lost 24 million of those people. So nearly half of those people were from the Soviet Union, and 20 million of those people were from China. So, if you think about the post-war order, the communist world versus the free world, over two-thirds of the people who died in World War II were from what became the communist world. And so that figures pretty prominently in why the Soviet Union and later China, when it became communist, were very aggressive towards the West and very aggressive in creating these buffer zones to protect themselves from invasion again. They did not want, another 20 million or 24 million to die. But it also explains why we would want to oppose that aggression from the communist world. So there was this again, kind of a mythology is a strong word, but kind of this narrative that developed after the war about why World War II. And the narrative was that we did not stand up to the despots and stand up to aggression early enough. And because we didn't, it grew until it was a global war that killed 60 million people. And really the nugget, the center of that lesson, if you will, is Munich. In Munich, after Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia, the Prime Minister of England, Chamberlain, met in Munich with Hitler, got an agreement on paper saying that, okay, I'm done invading places, I'm not going to invade anything else. And he went out on the steps and he waved the piece of paper and he declared peace in our time, right? And of course, later, not too much later, Hitler invaded Poland, and then England and France declared war, and then he invaded and took over France. And so that idea of appeasing aggression was really at the idea of this lesson of Munich that came out of World War II, that if you don't want another World War II, you have to stand up to aggressors early, and you have to stop aggression from happening or from getting out of hand, or we're going to have another World War. And throughout the Vietnam War, you would hear Lyndon Johnson and other folks say things like, I don't know how the Third World War is going to be fought, but the Fourth World War is going to be fought with sticks and stones. The idea being that it's going to be a nuclear exchange, it's going to destroy the world, and we're going to go back to living in caves and wearing grass skirts. So they were very, very concerned about another world war because it had two, right? And the first one was the worst war ever until the second one. And so, straight line progression, Third World War was going to wipe out the planet. So everything about our foreign policy was about stopping Third World War, and that's really the source of the Cold War. The UN is all about preventing a great power war. NATO is all about standing up to containing communist aggression so that it doesn't sweep into Western Europe and stop another global war. And that's really the backdrop for the post-war years that lead to the Vietnam War. You have to really put yourself in the chair of the President of the United States in the 1960s, whether that's Kennedy or that's Lyndon Johnson, to understand why they would commit U.S. forces to this little country in Southeast Asia that doesn't really have any resources that we need, that doesn't really have anything, speaking to why it's critical to our national defense. It was all about containing this communist expansion. So from their perspective, the communists were gaining ground in Asia. In 1949, the communists overthrew Chiang Kai-shek, and China became a communist country. We called it Red China, or Communist China. They got the bomb in the 60s, and so now you've got a nuclear-armed China. We fought a war with China in Korea, over Korea, for 4 or 5 years before we signed an armistice. And after the armistice, it was really just a ceasefire. We were still technically at war with North Korea and China on the Korean Peninsula, and we are to this day. So from the perspective of the president and foreign policy analysts, the communists were gaining ground. And again, lessons of Munich. You have to stop aggression early, because if you don't stop it early, it will only grow. Grow with feeding is what Secretary of State Dean Rusk used to say. Aggression grows with feeding, so we have to stop it early. And so really that's the genesis of this idea that we have to stop North Vietnam from taking over South Vietnam. There are a lot of different perspectives you could look at that. Vietnam was Indochina, one colony in the French Empire. They had always been one political unit, and to end that war in the 50s, we drew that line. That line between North and South was the line we had drawn. There were supposed to be elections, and we knew that the communists would win, so we kind of helped the elections not happen. So there are a lot of other ways of looking at it, but from the perspective of the president and the foreign policy experts in the country at the time, we were holding the line against communist aggression. And you would often see this, the domino theory, the idea that this is General Eisenhower called it the cork in the bottle. If we take the cork out of the bottle, the communists are going to spill all the way through to Thailand, to India, and they're going to take over all of Southeast and South Asia. So that's why Vietnam was so critically important. Something else that you have to understand about why the Vietnam War became so contentious and why we remember it the way we do is this. This war really happens on a generational divide. You've got the baby boomers who were born just before the end or immediately after the end of World War II, who did not grow up during World War II, or if they were infants. And they don't remember rationing. They don't remember the quote-unquote good war. They don't remember all the dads going off and brothers and uncles going off to war. They grew up in the post-war expansion, a time of real incredible economic expansion where everybody had a job. There was not a scarcity of money, not a scarcity of goods. Life was pretty good, and that's the time that they grew up in. And so a lot of things that generation, that greatest generation that had fought World War II, believed about America and your responsibilities to America, like everybody should serve. There's a draft, when the country calls or the country's under attack or the country has to defend its interests abroad, young men should go. Those were all things that generation had done, had physically done, had put their lives on the line to do, or had known brothers and uncles and dads who had done. But the generation after them had not lived through that period. And so, I have a 16-year-old son and a 22-year-old daughter, and, God bless teenagers. They know everything about everything, and they question everything that they're told. And that's how America grows. That's how any society grows. Is the kids grow up and they question all the assumptions, and that's how we get new ideas, and that's how we grow as a society. That was happening right here in the middle of this growing civil war, or this growing subversion of South Vietnam by North Vietnam. And so you have an older generation that has served, or all of their peers served, that lived through the time of World War II, that to them it's a clear-cut obligation for this new generation to serve and to participate in the defense of their country. And you've got this new generation that is questioning that assumption, because that's what young people do. They question assumptions and they think in new ways. And so, I don't want to paint this generation with a broad brush. A lot of people did serve. A lot of people volunteered, and they served with honor. And a lot of those people are in this room, but a lot of folks didn't. And that generational divide was very present while this war was going on, and it really, frankly, persists to today. You hear it a lot in our politics today. That the John Kerry picture went up, and I heard groans. And he did go serve, but then he came back and he opposed the war, and that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so this generational divide is still very much present. So that was the backdrop in August of 1964, and so. President Kennedy had died in November of 1963. President Johnson took over, and at that moment, South Vietnam looked like it was in a death spiral. And he was not going to be the president that lost Vietnam. Supposedly Democrats had lost China. I'm not exactly sure what they were supposed to do about not losing China, but that was the political narrative time, that they were weak on communism, that they had lost China, and he was not going to lose South Vietnam. And so as the North Vietnamese escalated, he was looking for ways to escalate as well. But frankly, in 1964, nobody was paying attention to Vietnam. Vietnam, if anything, when Kennedy came into office, President Eisenhower sat him down in that first meeting in the Oval Office, said, your entire presidency, you're going to be dealing with Laos. Laos is a powder keg. It's just going to take a spark and it's going to set it off. Vietnam was just a backwater in that conflict. It wasn't even on his radar. And so between that time and the time that Johnson took over, it really had, for the president and for the national policy, foreign policy elite, become center stage. But for the American people, they weren't really thinking about it. We had about 16,000 advisors in Vietnam, helping the South Vietnamese fight the Viet Cong insurgents, which were supported by the North, the communist insurgents that were supported by the North. But they were also doing some fighting of their own. If they got shot at, they'd shoot back. When the South Vietnamese went into combat, they were carried on American helicopters, and those American helicopters had guns, and if they got shot at, they shot back, or if they thought they were going to get shot at, they shot back. They were trying to help the South Vietnamese beat the Viet Cong, and they were, just like soldiers today, and soldiers whenever you served, or whatever period you grew up in, they don't like to lose, and they weren't going to let South Vietnam lose, so they were doing as much as they could without breaking the rules. But really, it wasn't on the radar back here in the United States. It just was not being paid attention to. And so throughout the first few months of Johnson's presidency, really until July, him and Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, and Dean Rusk, his Secretary of State, who were holdovers from President Kennedy, they pounded the pavement. They made the rounds of the news shows. They talked to reporters. They gave speeches trying to convince the American people that we have to do whatever it takes to defend South Vietnam, because this is the cork in the bottle, and if this country falls, all of Southeast Asia is going to fall to communism. And so they were not very successful because, again, people weren't really paying attention to it. And if you're not paying attention to it, you don't really know why your 18-year-old son should put on a uniform and go get shot at over it, because it's not that important to you. It's not really front and center on your radar. And so there was a discussion in about June or July where the National Security Council, the Secretaries of Defense and State and National Security Advisor and all the foreign policy advisors within the administration sat down and tried to decide, hey, what are we going to do about this Vietnam thing? And they decided, hey, we're going to make this resolution. It's basically going to be a blank check. It gives the president the authority to do whatever he wants in South Vietnam, and we're going to sit on it. And we're going to wait for something to happen to bring this up on the American people's radar. And when it does, then we've got a resolution in our hand, and we'll take it to Congress, we'll get it passed, and we'll be able to do what we need to do in Vietnam. And that pretext, that thing that happened, was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So I don't want to dive into it too far, but the North Vietnamese on the 2nd of August attacked a destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. It happened. There's no doubt about it. There are pictures of it. There were reports of it. They sank one North Vietnamese PT boat, and they had pictures of the oil slick. They saw it. They knew it happened. And so the foreign policy elites, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, they got together like, hey, this is it. This is our pretext. And the president said, okay, that was a one-off. It could have been an accident. We got to warn them, because if we don't warn them, the American people won't buy us doing something back. So we got to warn them. So the president gave a speech, said, North Vietnam, do not do it again, or there's going to be consequences. On the 4th of August, they sent another destroyer into the Gulf. They got a little closer to the edge of international waters, may have crossed them just a little bit, and they got a report, the President and the Secretary of Defense got a report that they had been attacked again. And they said, okay, that's it. That's our pretext. They got all the congressmen together, said, hey, this is all the congressional leaders together, said, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to bomb North Vietnam. It's going to be measured. It's going to be, proportionate to what they've done to us. It's going to target their PT boats, and it will warn them not to do it again. But the other thing we want to do is we want you to pass this resolution, and we just happen to have a copy right here, and it says that you authorize me to do whatever it takes to defend South Vietnam. And what they told the congressman in that room is very important, and it's going to come up again in a few minutes. What they told the congressman in that room was, we're having you pass this resolution as a deterrent. When the North Vietnamese see this resolution, they're going to understand that we're serious and that we're willing to go to war over South Vietnam. And when you combine it with this bombing we're going to do, it's going to make them knock it off, and it's going to make them talk, and we're going to settle this thing. And they may have believed that. There's very good evidence that they really believed that that would stop it, that might bring the North Vietnamese to the table. And so they did the bombing of targets in North Vietnam. They passed the resolution, and you saw the picture, all the congressmen, only 2 senators, Senator Morse and Senator Greening, are the only guys who voted against it, and they were kind of irascible, and the rest of the senators didn't really like them anyways, and so they were kind of shunned to the side. But boy, in 3 or 4 years, those guys got really popular because they looked really smart. But the resolution passed, and the president had this authorization. It's very important, again, what he had said to those congressmen. He had told them it was a deterrent, and he had no plan to go to war. You might remember there was a presidential election going on at the time, and he was telling everybody, I'm not going to send American boys to fight a war that Asian boys should be fighting. That's pretty much a quote of what he said. And he was contrasting himself with Senator Barry Goldwater, who, you've probably seen the Daisy commercial where she's picking petals off the flower and it turns into a countdown to a nuclear explosion. That was an ad against Goldwater. So the president's painting himself as measured. I don't want to start a war. I don't want to get in a war with communists. I just want him to knock it off. Look at this Goldwater guy. He's going to get you in World War III. And that, combined with the bombing, got him reelected by a landslide in November. But while he was saying that he wasn't planning on starting a war, what he was telling his own folks was, this is really my insurance policy. Whatever I do in Vietnam, I hope that this works. I hope that they're going to come to the table. But if I got to do more, Congress can't really say anything because they gave me this piece of paper that says I can do whatever I want in Vietnam, which obviously is not what they told Congress or what he told the congressman. The other thing that's very important about that piece of paper is it's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution now. That's not the official name, but that's what everybody called it at the time and what they call it today. Historians today have pretty much proven that second attack, that attack on the 4th of August, didn't happen. There's no photographic evidence. There's no material evidence. After the fact, reporters went back and talked to people who were on the boat, and they're not sure. At best, they're not sure, but it probably did not happen. And so, now that Vietnam, the country of Vietnam, is a trading partner and an ally, historians have been able to go into Vietnam and dig through their archives, and they can find no evidence that attack was ordered. And so, probably didn't happen, but even if it did happen, there was enough evidence that it didn't happen that later a lot of questions would come up. And that's very important to this question that I'm trying to answer, which is why we remember the war the way we do. So at the same time that the war, the president, he got the authorization, the North Vietnamese didn't stop what they were doing. In fact, they started ramping it up because they saw what was coming. They're like, okay, Americans are starting to get involved. We need to win this thing fast before they can get here. So they started ramping up. We started ramping up. We started a continuous bombing campaign. Then we sent Marines to protect the airfields. Then we sent soldiers to actually fight in direct combat in Vietnam. And we started out with about 100,000. A few years later, we'd have over 500,000 there in a gradual escalation. While that escalation was happening, really, especially in 1965, there was this small group within America that was really starting to question this whole containment thing, this whole Cold War thing. And it really had 3 major pieces to it, 3 kind of groups of leaders. And they're represented here. Those first 2 folks on the left are senators, Senator Morse and Senator who voted against the resolution, one of the 2 guys who voted against the resolution. But the other guy is really important, J. William Fulbright. He actually was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He actually ushered the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through the Senate and got it voted on and got it approved by an overwhelming majority. But he was also starting to have questions about this whole Cold War thing because he saw us getting drug into Vietnam, and he's like, what does Vietnam have to do with the national security of the United States? And so these guys were starting to question the Cold War consensus. That's what historians call it. This idea, this kind of universal idea that we have to contain communism. The second group there in the middle were academics. 1965, there was the first teach-ins, which was basically professors who weren't so sure about this whole Cold War thing, getting students together and having lectures about containment and about Vietnam and how wrong-headed it was. But it's important, again, it's important because these are the first folks that are starting to talk about, hey, maybe this Cold War thing, maybe we need to back out of this or think of a different way to do our foreign policy. And then the last group are the group that we all remember, those anti-war activists. Students for a Democratic Society was kind of chief among them. You also had Abby Hoffman and the Yippies, which was kind of, they kind of did a lot of street theater protests that drew a lot of negative attention from mainstream America because it was frankly a little goofy. And but they were also, if you look at the writings at the time, they were also questioning, hey, maybe we can find a way to coexist with the Soviet Union that doesn't require us to have millions of men, stationed, garrisoned in Germany and fighting in Vietnam. And so this group really was active from 1965, when the escalation really began in Vietnam, until about 1967, late 1967, early 1968. And the reason is because just like in our political discourse today, if you oppose a political idea, you find the most ridiculous person espousing that idea, and you make them the poster child of that idea as a way to mock it, as a way to discredit it, as a way to make it go away. And that's exactly what happened. Pro-war supporters in the media, pro-war supporters in the government, pro-war supporters in intelligentsia focused on the protesters. And they kind of made themselves a target. Up here in the top left was a march in 67 on Washington, D.C. That flag in the bottom right corner, that's the Viet Cong flag, the flag of the National Liberation Front. They're marching with it on Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Capitol. They would march with signs with Mao Zedong's picture. They'd march with Chinese communist flags, really drawing the ire of mainstream America. They were burning draft cards. And remember, I talked about this generational divide. You've got World War II vets and people who lived through World War II who think it's their obligation to serve, and they're out there burning draft cards. These guys became the focus of ire about the anti-war movement and about this foreign policy revolution, and it drowned out J. William Fulbright, and it drowned out the intellectuals and the academics, and really killed the movement. And so in 1967, Fulbright had been holding hearings for years on the Cold War and containment and should we be doing it, and he decided, hey, this isn't working. We're just putting more and more people into the war, and it's not working. We need to change course. And in the summer of 1967, there had been an article. Nobody really paid any attention to it, but it ran in the newspaper. It was an AP article, and it ran in the newspaper in Arkansas, where J. William Fulbright was from. And the article said, hey, this Gulf of Tonkin thing, it didn't happen quite the way they said it did, and it probably didn't happen at all. And it was very thorough, and it had a lot of interviews from people who were there. And J. William Fulbright got his guys to work on it, and at the end of 1967, he said, in 1968, we're going to hold hearings on that. And it turned out to be a fateful decision because 1968 was a tough year for the war in Vietnam. Throughout late 1967, General Westmoreland, General Johnson, who was Chief of Staff in the Army, had been saying, hey, light at the end of the tunnel. We're almost done with this thing. The Viet Cong's on their heels. And then in January, and early February, really, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army started what we now call the Tet Offensive. And the history paints this as the turning point in the war, the time when everybody decided we don't want to be in Vietnam anymore, we need to just get out. And that's not true, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. But it is important because the president and military leaders have been saying we're winning the war, and now we've got Viet Cong guerrillas in the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It doesn't look like we're winning this war. right in the middle of this, J. William Fulbright holds his hearings on the Gulf of Tonkin and shows that the Gulf of Tonkin incident probably didn't happen. The president had a resolution before there was ever an incident, and they were planning on escalating before they actually had the resolution. And that really dramatically changed the debate. Now the debate's not about should we defend South Vietnam, it's about did the president lie to us to get us into this war. And it didn't create a collapse of support for the war, and I'll show you that in a minute. But it did create a collapse of support for President Johnson, and on 31 March he announced, I'm not running for re-election. It was really the end of his presidency. So I promised I'd show it, and I'm going to show you right now. Again, the narrative is the Tet Offensive happened and Americans quit the war. This survey shows 53% of Americans either want to stay in Vietnam and tough it out, or they want to do even more. They want to send more guys. They want to bomb them into the Stone Age. There was even like 5 or 6% wanted to nuke North Vietnam, and that was consistent throughout the Vietnam War. So American people, this is after the Tet Offensive, the American people had not quit on the war. They had quit on President Johnson. But the reason this is important, and this is another picture that shows it, this is President Johnson's support, and that you can see where the Tet Offensive is there in 1968, kind of the low point. He comes back up after he announces he's not going to run. He's like, I'm not going to run. I'm going to focus on ending the war. But then as the war doesn't end, his numbers go back down. But the reason I bring this up, and the reason that I think this is key to this question of why we remember the war the way we do, is because that line where the Tet Offensive is also the line where people who were opposed to the war stopped arguing over whether we should defend Vietnam and started arguing over the president's lying to you, the military's lying to you, we got lied into this war, we went to war for the wrong reasons. And that really remained the narrative for the rest of the war. The Vietnam veterans against the war, I don't know if you have been able to sit through any of the testimony of John Kerry in the Senate. What he was saying is the president and the Army is lying to you about what's happening there. He says things like, they're cutting off ears, and it's like Genghis Khan going through villages and things like that. The reason it resonated with some in America is because he was hitting that theme again, the theme that continued throughout the war, that, hey, you're being lied to about this war. It's a lie. And that really is, in large part, why we remember the war now the way we did. Before 1968, and before this change in tactics, there was not a lot of talk about did we get lied into the war, or was the administration lying. There was a little bit, but after the Fulbright hearings, really that was the dominant theme for the rest of the war. It was made even more kind of the theme. It became the dominant theme because Robert Kennedy and G. McCarthy, who were running for president at the time, they were both still arguing, why are we defending South Vietnam? And they lost the election. And nothing convinces people to change tactics like losing. And the Democrats and the anti-war movement, which was not all Democrats, they changed tactics because they had lost an election with their peace candidates. And so with that, I would be happy to talk about this, answer any questions you have, or talk about anything else that you want to talk about.
So when did this become said as a police action? Because like in schools, they often say, oh, it's not a war, it's a police action. So how did that perception come to be, since it's not exactly what happens?
So I showed one of the first slides I showed where I was talking about how we remember the war. There's this book, it's in the Army slide, how the Army remembers this war. There's a slide with a book by Harry Summers. It's called On Strategy. And it was really the first Army treatise on why we lost the Vietnam War. There have been a lot of AARs and there have been a lot of studies, but this was really the first dominant voice by an Army leader. He was a colonel in the Army at the time, talking about why we lost the war. And what he talked about was, the first half of his book. The second half of his book is we should have fought harder and we should have taken the gloves off and we should have went into North Vietnam and should have went into Laos. But the first half of his book is all about we didn't bring the American people along. We didn't get the American people's support for this war. And again, I showed you slides of people marching in the street in support of the war. I showed you surveys from the time that the majority of people wanted to fight this war even harder, even 3 years into it. But that narrative, that idea that this wasn't a declared war, this wasn't somehow a legitimate war, and so the American people were never enlisted for support, is very dominant in the narrative and how we understand the war today. And that's kind of where that idea of police action and this is a conflict, not a war because we didn't declare it comes from. Of course, not to put too fine a point on it, but that's completely ahistorical. I mean, we've only declared war, a handful of times in our history, but we fought a lot of wars. The Marines in the Marine hymn talks about the shores of Tripoli, the halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli. Neither one of those were declared wars, but we sure were there and we sure were shooting. But this idea that it wasn't a declared war, that it was a police action that was somehow less legitimate because we hadn't got American people along, is a big part of this deception narrative. And HR McMaster, his book Dereliction of Duty, that's another kind of sub-theme of his book, is what the generals, what the chiefs of staff wanted was to mobilize the reserve, because that would require Congress to specifically authorize troops on the ground, and it would bring the American people along. So this is kind of a recurring theme in the histories, contemporary and from the time of the war. And I think it's rolled into that idea of deception. I hope that answers the question. I think, sorry.
I was wondering if you have, how many civilians were killed, in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, maybe in Cambodia, over all of that time. And do you have any statistics in your book about those numbers?
I probably do, but I probably couldn't tell you standing up here right now. This was a human tragedy, and I don't want to minimize at all the weight of the tragedy on civilians on both sides of the border, and on both countries, and on Cambodia and on Laos, who had a lot of civilian casualties and a lot of turmoil after we left Vietnam. But this idea of civilian casualties, I didn't talk about it because I was run short on time. But this was also rolled up in this deception idea, right? Because in Christmas time, 1967, at the same time that J. William Fulbright had announced he was going to hold hearings on Gulf of Tonkin the next year, there were a bunch of New York Times articles. A reporter actually went to North Vietnam, to Hanoi and to the outskirts of Hanoi, which America had just started bombing. And the president, God bless him, President Johnson, had been telling American people, hey, we're bombing anti-aircraft guns in the middle of farms out in the middle of nowhere. There's no civilians dying. And then this reporter went out there and found, inevitable, frankly, civilian casualties. That's why wars are bad, because civilians die. This was very much wrapped up in this idea of deception. The president's lying to you. And it was really, that first Gulf of Tonkin article, J. William Fulbright's announcement, and those articles on civilian casualties really started, they were pushing that boulder off the cliff. You think of that, Indiana Jones, that first scene where that boulder's chasing him out of that cave, that they really pushed that, they hit the trigger that pushed that boulder over the edge. And then once it started to gain steam with the Tet Offensive, it really, rolled over Vietnam War policy. Great question, though. I've got a question. Is there...
Hold on.
Yeah, let her bring...
We have people in order waiting.
We'll get you next, sir. Sorry.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, I was 18 at the time. I didn't know what the hell to think. I was confused as hell about right, wrong, or indifferent. Have there been any surveys among these various factions in American society about what they think now?
There have. So at the time, there's a ton. I mean, it's a historian's dream. There's a ton of survey data segregated by different populations. Gallup was all over the place. A lot of universities were all over the place. So we got a pretty good idea of what folks your age at the time thought. And there's this idea that they were all marching in the streets with Viet Cong flags. The majority of kids, just like their parents, supported American foreign policy and supported this idea that we've got to stop communism because they'd grown up with it. That divide has really continued. And, another big key piece of my book that I didn't talk about today because it's kind of historian-ish, but there's a big debate among historians whether Vietnam ended the Cold War. And to me, that's silly because the Cold War didn't end until the Berlin Wall came down. We were in Nicaragua. We were helping in Honduras. We were aiding Contra rebels. We were all over the world trying to contain communism up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. But what I found, and I looked at data from post-war, was that the American people didn't abandon the idea of the Cold War. Because this debate, people stopped arguing that we shouldn't defend South Vietnam and stopped arguing that we shouldn't contain communism. After 1968, they said none of that matters. You got lied into this war and you're being lied to about it now. And they just hit on that over and over and over again until the war ended. But people had stopped attacking the Cold War, so after Vietnam, rank-and-file Americans continued to believe that we should contain communism and that communism was bad, democracy was good. Now, everybody who we supported wasn't necessarily democratic, and everybody the Soviet Union supported wasn't necessarily communist, but that was the picture that most Americans had. But inside the foreign policy elite, the Congress, the parties, the Democratic Party really congealed around this idea that we needed to move beyond the Cold War and containment to a newer foreign policy. President Carter talked about a human rights foreign policy and a foreign policy based on human rights. And when President Bill Clinton took office, he revived that after the Cold War. Whereas the Republican Party increasingly became identified, especially because of Nixon, who was the anti-communist, kind of the prototype. They became identified with this idea of defending the free world against communism. And that debate has spilled way beyond the Cold War. We're still kind of having it today in one way or the other. And so that data absolutely exists. So that's a long answer to your question, which is really American people continued to support American foreign policy of containment after the war. This gentleman's been trying to get a question. Okay, yeah.
One of the things that struck me as a veteran of Vietnam was the circumstance that our national leadership was really fearful of making major commitments early on. And as a consequence, as you just pointed out a moment ago, when the gauntlet was thrown to the ground after the Bay of Tonkin, they did not move towards sending over troop formations like they would in a normal circumstance of a declared war. It was piecemeal. And the draft spun up and caught probably, amongst the veterans that may be in this room, probably 70% of us. And as we went in as individuals, we also went overseas as individuals in replacements, and we came home as individuals. And one of the scars, I think, of that period was the circumstance that there was no cohesion with regards to our semblance of what we had gone to do and what we had done while we were there. And as we came back, we weren't received like our parents, okay? And again, the lesson that I think that you spoke earlier about the generals that were staff officers, they witnessed that. And so the next time we prosecuted a war because we felt threatened, for whatever reason, the first Gulf War, formations went over together and formations came home, and we celebrated their return. It's a painful experience to see a generation that had to bear that, but the light at the end of the tunnel is that you learn a lesson as a nation. We always have to think about the people who bear the burden of standing a watch, keeping us safe, and their loved ones who have to worry about them. It's interesting today, we still have people in national leadership roles who are so much concerned about control that they're not serving the electorate who bears everything.
So there's a lot rolled up in that, and I do want to. I think the first piece of that is the escalation and the way it happened gradually, and I think the second part's the kind of rotations and how we do wars now, and I want to talk about both of them if I could. The first, that first piece, the escalation. This is not a topic of my book because there's been so much great scholarship on it already. HR McMaster, I should get credit. I should get a royalty because I've mentioned his book about 5 times. It's a great book, and he's a great officer. But also, Fred Logeval has done a lot of work on this, and some other folks. This idea of why we did it the way we did at the beginning. It seems silly now, right? The Powell doctrine or the Weinberger doctrine of go big or don't go at all, and commit the nation, and it all comes out of this, right? It all comes out of this idea of gradualism lost the war, which again Harry Summers was kind of the first guy to really make it a household idea, but it had been out there for a long time. So, but the reason, I think the historical consensus on the reason we did it that way was all about Korea, right? Because we didn't want another Korea. I mean, you read the papers. I was at the LBJ library doing research for this, and you read the papers of the guys at the time. We talk about the ghost of Vietnam. The ghost of Korea was looming over them, and they did not want another Korea. And Jerome Ridgway famously said the lesson of Korea is don't fight a land war in Asia, right? And so they did not want to fight a land war in Asia. And so if they could do anything else except, or if they could do just a little bit of it, make the South Vietnamese do most of it, maybe they wouldn't have to fight a land war in Asia. And of course, we know now that was wrong-headed, and it just prolonged the human tragedy. There's also a discussion, which I won't get into here, about was the war winnable at all? And there are volumes of books, or was it winnable the way we were fighting it? And so we still wrestle with that question. But the reason we did it the way we did it was because we didn't want to do it, I think is what it comes down to. And anything we could do to not do it, backing into it or doing it a little, I'm going to do this and I'm going to wait to see if he sees that as a signal and does something. That's really what we did for 3 or 4 years. And then the other piece of it, the rotational piece, absolutely the legacy of the Vietnam War, the way the Army fought Gulf War, and the way the Army is fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. We send whole units, and it's because of the personal tragedy that you're inflicting on an individual soldier and his family by just uprooting him, sending him as a lone replacement to a unit that's been in combat for 8 years and sees 100% turnover every year. We learned a hard lesson from that, and it creates other problems, right? My first book that I talked about here, Task Force Patriot, I talked about the fact that, we in Iraq, I thought the war had ended because it was supposed to end in 11, but we're back there. I said that we hadn't fought an 8-year war. We had fought 8 one-year wars because a unit would go there, take 3 months to figure out what's going on. You get 6 months of good broken field running, and then you spent 3 months figuring out how to hand it over to the next guy. And we just did that over and over and over again, and it's very hard to solve the problem. So it creates its own problems. I personally am glad that I didn't have to spend 8 years straight in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it creates a whole different, bunch of problems that we'll be wrestling with in the next war, with the lessons of Iraq.
So we're going to take the last question, which will be over here to
this gentleman
Melissa
here.
will have.
This gentleman here has been waiting since the beginning. So,
2 quick questions. One, in the Johnson papers, there was a statement that he knew we couldn't win. What do you think of that statement?
I'm not sure late in the war. I think in 1968, I think he had finally been convinced that we were going to have to negotiate our way out of it. But I think he absolutely believed that we could win this war. And what I see when I read his papers and read the papers of the people around him was just incredible disbelief that the most powerful nation in the world was not just rolling over the Viet Cong in North Vietnam, and just intense frustration. There's a great quote, and I'm going to butcher it, in Harry Summers' book, where he says that the young guys blamed the generals and the generals blamed the civilians for why we weren't winning. But it went back down too, right? The civilians blamed the generals, and the generals blamed those kids that weren't as tough as we were when we were in World War II. So it was. I think there was just this universal frustration and confusion with why it went on so long and we weren't able to win. And that's a topic I could bore the hell out of you for like 8 hours on, but I promise I won't. So.
The other question is pretty simple, I think. Did you have to submit the book to DOD before your book to DOD
Yeah.
before publication?
So I said at the beginning that I'm not sure what the Department of Defense's actual position is on the Vietnam War. After having to go through that process, thank God they don't actually have an official opinion, or I would have been in trouble. Actually, I'm a serving Army officer on active duty. And so I have to submit to make sure that I'm not revealing any state secrets. But I will say that the Army and the Department of Defense, not a paid political announcement, are very open to having these debates about foreign policy and about our history. And as you get closer to current, maybe they're a little less eager to hear your opinion, but they do let you express it as long as you make it clear that it's your opinion and not the Army's. They're just reviewing to make sure that you're not revealing anything classified, which it's Vietnam War. We pretty much know what happened. So, okay. Thank you.
So thanks, Pat, very much. And as I listen to this, I'm glad that young people who barely remember it or don't remember it are writing the history, because there's so many memories in those pictures. And I think many of us in this room can recall those days, and they were hard days, whether you were in Vietnam or you were back here trying to figure out what was happening to our country. And I hope we don't ever have to relive a time like that again. So we will do this again on the first Wednesday in August, which I think is August 4th, but I'm unsure, so look at your calendar. But the first Wednesday in August, our speaker will be Dr. Brian Lynn from Texas A&M University, and he'll be speaking on his new book, Elvis's Army. I want to emphasize the word Army. He's not going to talk a lot about Elvis. He's going to talk about the Army in the 1950s in which Elvis served, and which was an important time for the 1st Infantry Division, and I hope you'll come back and see that. And I hope if you haven't noticed already, there's a red, white, and blue mailbox back here, Cantini Post 556, the American Legion, of which I am a proud member, as are the veterans back there. Will gladly accept a donation for the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans in Wheaton, which we support. It is a fantastic institution. There are, we estimate that tonight 1,100 honorably discharged veterans of the American Armed Forces in the state of Illinois will sleep on the streets because they've got nowhere to live. And that shelter tries hard to solve that problem in DuPage County. And if you want to pick up some literature or learn a little bit about it, they're there, and we'll gladly make sure that your dimes and nickels go to that very, very important cause. And don't forget, August 26th, or any day thereafter, is a good day to come back and see the 1st Division Museum because it's going to be an awesome museum. So for Pat, we have two things. One is he talked a lot about literature, and we're going to give him a copy of this. This is our most recent book. It's published by the university, actually published by the University of Missouri, but the 1st Division Museum sponsored it. My good friend, a combat veteran and a retired officer, Greg Fontenot, is the author, and the topic is the 1st Infantry Division and the U.S. Army Transformed, the Road to Victory in Desert Storm, 1970 to 1991. So he picks up the story where Pat left it off, the division coming home from Vietnam, and he talks about how do we rebuild that Army, how do we recover from this experience, mainly to win the Cold War. And it was the Cold War Army, that reformed Cold War Army, that we happened to take to combat in Desert Storm. So that's one thing we have for you, so we'll give you that. Yeah. And then the other thing we have, which is I think absolutely fantastic, is every year we commission our own coin. I won't bore you with what these mean in terms of the history of the regiments of the Army, but the 1st Division Museum has a coin. The front is always the same, but we change the back every year. So we've had the anniversary of D-Day, the anniversary in 2015, it was Vietnam because the 50th anniversary of the deployment, and so on and so forth. And this year, it's the centennial of the 1st Division, a century of service. There you go. So if you bought a book, Pat will sign it for you. If you didn't, go buy one. Thank you for coming. Thank you. All right, good job. Yeah, that was great.
Very good. Can I allude to the